Morning, everybody, and thanks for joining this event today. Happy Windrush Day to everybody attending. This country owes a huge debt to the Windrush generation. The injustices that their generation and their families have faced have not gone away. People are still struggling to secure their status, access compensation. These conversations are even more salient today, given the backdrop of continued hostility, new developments, including the publication of the Windrush Lessons Learned review in March, and of course the growing global movement for Black lives and racial justice. We've got an incredible programme this morning with fantastic speakers, experts, community leaders, panelists and guests. Thanks to City Hall for hosting this event. Thanks to everybody attending. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to hand over to Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London. Mr. Mayor.
Thanks, Satbir. Before you hear from the fantastic speakers, I thought I'd say a couple of words, if that's okay. Can I also begin by saying happy Windrush Day? And can I thank Satbir, JCWI, my Deputy Mayor, Dr. Debbie Weeks, Bernard, Patrick, and everyone for helping organise this event. I'm really sorry it can't happen in person for reasons that are obvious. I wanted to say a few things before we hear from Patrick and have the discussion, which is this should be a day when we celebrate and commemorate the amazing contribution made to our city by those that came on Empire Windrush and their children and grandchildren. But there are a few things which, as Setler alluded to, mean that we can't celebrate because there's lots of work to be done to make sure we get justice for all those who've been affected by the hostile environment. And actually, it begs a number of questions that we only began having Windrush Day 2 years ago. This is the second one ever, when we know the ship arrived 72 years ago. And I've got to be frank, when I went to school, I'm born and raised in London, I was never taught about the massive contribution made by those who came to this country to rebuild the country after the Second World War. I was never taught that this generation came to fill the vacancies that couldn't be filled by anyone else. But I've seen for myself the massive contribution made to our city. And one of the jobs we have to do is to make sure our peers and our children and our grandchildren, whatever their background, ethnicity, religion, understand the huge debt of gratitude we have to the Windrush generation. Now, Patrick's been campaigning for some years now to make sure Londoners and around the country know a bit more about our rich history, but also he's been campaigning to get justice for the Windrush generation. I was really proud to support the Windrush Justice Fund, but also proud to support the Justice Together project, because the sad truth is there are in London today more than 130,000 young people who are undocumented, and JCWI and others do a huge amount of work to help them. But we've got a campaign to make sure a number of things happen. We've got to make sure that the recommendations made from Wendy Williams are actioned, all 30. No more talking, but action. We've got to make sure the government stops the extortionate fees having to be paid by people to regularise their documentation. We've got to make sure that the 5% of claim compensation goes to 100%. Really, really important going forward. We've got to make sure we end the hostile environment and on. So look, I just wanted to say a few words before Patrick comes in. But the last thing I want to say is this. One of our jobs is to make sure people understand the inextricable link between the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, about the way the Windrush generation have been treated in the hostile environment, and some of the campaigning taking place around Black Lives Matter. It is the case in 2020, in the most progressive city in the world, if you're a black person, you suffer racism, discrimination and equality that many others don't. And our job as the Coalition of the Willing is to address that. So look, I want to thank you for joining this call. Thank you for the campaigning you are doing. Many of you campaign day in, day out. As a city, we're grateful to you. You'll be hearing from Debbie later on during the course of this morning. But it's my pleasure to introduce somebody I call a friend. He's a campaigner, he's a Londoner, he's done a huge amount in this area. I'm looking forward to hearing from him and hearing his speech. But I'm really grateful for the contribution he's made to having this debate go on, but also to having meaningful action. And so without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Patrick Vernon.
Thanks very much, Sadiq. You're a friend too, and and that's important in terms of solidarity in these troubling times that we face. Just want to recognise the JCWI team, Sadiq and also Debbie Weeks-Bernard in organising today's event. It would be great if we met in person, but maybe next year we can do that in a more powerful way. As you know, we're going to start off with a minute's silence. Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, just literally done 2 minutes silence at Lambeth Palace at 11 o'clock, also paying tribute to the Windrush generation who've died, paying tribute to those people, frontline workers, and those who have died because of COVID-19, and also recognising the ongoing injustices faced by Black and minority communities, especially around Black Lives Matter. So I'd like us to take a minute's silence to reflect on lost lives and how we can work together collectively for a better London. Thank you very much. There's a lot to say, but obviously we have a very tight agenda. So I've just got a couple of points I'd like to share. Obviously Windrush Day has been a long journey, but I have to give acknowledgement to the work of the Windrush Foundation, Arthur Torrance and the Windrush Foundation, and particularly the late Sam King, who was a veteran, served in the Second World War, was a passenger on the Empire Windrush ship, and kept for many years a diary where he kept regular dialogue with those men and women that were on the ship. So they laid the foundations in terms of reminding us of the importance of the Windrush ship. And I suppose I've taken it to a level around the whole campaign for a National Windrush Day, working with a whole range of organisations and activists for many, many years. But we all know that we got that day because of the scandal. And that's why Windrush Day will always be a bittersweet day. A bitter day in terms of the ongoing injustice faced by the Windrush generation, but also a recognition how London and many parts of Britain have changed for the good because of not just the Windrush generation, but all migrants who have made a difference to Britain. And I think that's really important as well to acknowledge that. Also, I think in terms of the injustice, I know there's going to be a debate about this, but on Friday afternoon, I was with 5 Windrush people. Anthony Bryant, who was featured with his drama about his life called Sitting in Limbo. Paulette Wilson and her daughter, Natalie, came all the way down from Wolverhampton. Yes, we were social distancing, by the way, Mayor. We had Michael Breathwaite from Islington, and we also had Iwaldo Romeo from Edmonton. Most of them were Londoners, but obviously there were lots of people affected by the scandal outside London. And I was there, and Satbir from JCWI joined me because we worked together over the last couple of years around the Windrush Justice Fund, which was supported by the Mayor and others, trying to have justice, trying to give free advice. I know that the BCA, Black Culture Archives, have benefited from that, and they were the first organisation in Britain to start the surgeries nearly 2 years ago with the support of Jacqueline McKenzie, who's been doing a lot of work, excellent work around legal advice and support. But we presented a petition to number 10 for the full implementation of the Lessons Learned review. It's a petition I launched literally the same week when Wendy Williams' report was published and read out by Priti Patel in Parliament. And 130,000 people signed that petition demanding the full implementation of the Lessons Learned review, but also recognising that compensation scheme needs to be done more quickly and effectively. And we found out today that obviously there's a new cross-party advisory group, government advisory group, regarding that, and I'm sure we'll have a debate about that, how effective it will be. But what's quite clear, the lessons have not been written, they're still outstanding, and justice still needs to be done for the Windrush generation, their children and their grandchildren. which the government has not acknowledged, and that is why the deportation issue is still ongoing, and we need to fight and resist that. But I could go on, guys, but I'm not going to. I'm going to do something a bit different. I'm going to read a poem in terms of how I finish. And this poem, you're probably familiar with this poem. I've read it a couple of times, I've modified it. First There Came For. This poem was first written by Pastor Nimla, a victim of the Holocaust. Then in the 1980s, it was then modified by an African American disability rights activist called Shafiq Asante, and I've amended it, taking into account the issues around Black Lives Matter, Windrush, etc. So it's called First They Came For. First they came for the black man. They said he was a menace to society, a drug dealer, a school dropout, very violent to all humanity, but I was not a black man. I said nothing and did nothing. Then they came for the welfare mothers on universal credit. They said they were lazy, overweight, had too many children, a drain on society, but I was not on welfare. I was not a woman. I said nothing and did nothing. Then they came for the LGBT community. They said they were corrupt society, they were morally and sexually depraved, and would cause confusion and wickedness with young people. But I was not LGBT. I said nothing and did nothing. Next, they came for people with mental health problems and learning disabilities. They said they had nothing to give to society, they were ill, disabled, and a drain on society. But I had no mental health problems or learning disabilities. I said nothing and did nothing. Then they came for the elderly. They said there were too many taxpayers' money was spent on them, too much money spent on care homes. They were also draining society, but I was not elderly. And again, I said nothing and did nothing. Then they came for people of Muslim faith. They said they were cropped on way of life, values, but I was not a Muslim. I said nothing and did nothing. Then they came for people of Jewish faith. They had too much wealth and influence and would undermine our values too. But I was not Jewish. I said nothing and did nothing. Then they came for the Windrush generation. They said they were not British, they did not contribute to the country, and they were low-hanging fruit and need to be deported. But I was not from the Windrush generation. I said nothing and did nothing. Then they came for the refugees and asylum seekers. They were also not British too. They were draining society, and the hostile environment will sort them out and force them to go back where they belong. But I was not a refugee or asylum seeker. I said nothing and did nothing. Then they came for the frontline workers in NHS, transport and retail. They were low skilled, don't deserve any PP during COVID-19 and should be left to die. But I was not a frontline worker. I said nothing and did nothing. Then they came to us. We told them Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, we will fight the power. We drove and ran them out of London and the rest of the country so they could plot no more. That poem is really about why we're here today. It's not just about the Windrush generation, which is very important. It's about fighting inclusion and a better London. And this is important as we embark on a period of time in British history where there's lots of uncertainty, but we need to create the clarity for ourselves and for the next generation. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for that wonderful poem. Incredible contribution to today's discussion. It reminds me a lot of something that the late Tony Benn once said, which was that we should be careful of how governments treat refugees and those from other places, because it is how the rest of us would be treated if they thought they could get away with it. Those words that you sort of shared with us are incredibly poignant and important for all of us, I think, to hear today. We are next moving to a panel discussion, and we're really lucky to be joined by a fantastic panel for this conversation today. We've got with us Arike from the Black Cultural Archives. Arike is the BCA's visionary new managing director. For those who are not familiar with the Black Cultural Archives, The BCA's groundbreaking work memorialises, unpacks and celebrates the history of Black Britain, and has been at the forefront of efforts to support, organise and campaign for justice with the Windrush generation. Arike will also be representing the Black Cultural Archives on the new interdepartmental government working group established today to right the wrongs that we learned about 2 years ago in the Windrush scandal. Also on the panel, we have Jacqueline McKenzie. Jackie is the director of the Centre for Migration Advice and Research and a partner and human rights lawyer with the firm McKenzie, Bute & Pope. Jackie has been supporting, advocating with and for members of the Windrush generation and victims of an increasingly hostile immigration policy landscape for many, many years. Jackie served on the advisory group for the Windrush Lessons Learned review and helped to establish Windrush Action, an independent group leading the ongoing campaign for justice. And the third member of our panel is the Reverend Clive Foster, who is a senior pastor with the Pilgrim Church in Nottingham. The Reverend Foster has managed various projects with the Pilgrim Church, including hosting the Reverend Jesse Jackson on 2 occasions, organising Nottingham's bicentenary celebration for the abolition of slavery. And in recent years, he's been leading the Pilgrim Church's response to the Windrush scandal, including organising drop-in advice surgeries and providing advice to the Home Office on their policy response to the crisis. We're really grateful to have all 3 of you today. For those joining the event as attendees, I see that some of you have already found the Q&A box. If you've got questions for any of the panelists, please pop them in the box, and then once we've heard introductory remarks from all 3 panelists, I'll be able to review them and hand them over to the panelists for discussion. So I'll hand over first to Arike, and we're inviting our panelists to perhaps talk for 10 or 15 minutes about their sense of what the continuing needs of people who have survived the Windrush scandal are, what the movement for justice looks like going forward, what the sort of rays of hope there might be, and how those attending, those listening in, can get involved in some of that work. So Arike, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone for organising this, and especially thanks to JCWI and Patrick Vernon, who have both been incredibly supportive of Black Cultural Archives and the work that we're trying to do to really connect people with help that they need, specifically around accessing the compensation scheme. So I'm not going to actually, I probably won't talk for 10 minutes because some of the events I've been in recently, we've talked for so long that we didn't have time for questions and answers. So I will try and keep it relatively brief. But I wanted to mention that I took over the role of Managing Director at Black Cultural Archives in March last year. Black Cultural Archives' involvement with the Windrush scandal and really trying to campaign on behalf of people who are named the Windrush generation predates me at Black Cultural Archives, obviously. And Jackie McKenzie, who's on this call, and Patrick Vernon know that very well. This year, 2020, if we can believe that at the beginning of this year we were actually all allowed to meet in person, but this year, in January this year, we held a public meeting to really try to update ourselves and also the communities on the latest of what was happening. And one of the reasons that we held that public meeting was because there was so little information coming through from the Home Office. There was so they were not able or willing to share data on how many people had access to the scheme. They were not able or willing to share how much compensation payments had been offered or accepted. So at the time that we held that meeting back in January, we were really trying to kind of not only share information as much as we could get, but also to try and motivate the Home Office to also share information. Patrick Vernon and Jackie were part of that meeting. and it was supported by the Windrush Justice Fund. So Black Cultural Archives is a heritage organisation, and we get involved in these issues because we understand that the past is now. We understand that these issues that affect our communities, that affect whether or not Black people or Asian people or whoever are disproportionately affected by the pandemic. We understand that where there's an ethnicity pay gap, where in cultural institutions the governance of those institutions are predominantly white, we understand that that actually is to do with the past, and that history completely informs the journey that we're on now and where we're going in the future. So that is why a heritage institution like Black Cultural Archives gets involved in this. And another reason is that we are the only national heritage institution that is Black-led and that looks at the history of this country through the gaze, through the lens of Blackness, rather than it being a diversity project or a tick box or an inclusion project. Actually, we are changing the point of view of how we look at history. And so it's really important to us that we are engaged with what's going on now. But because we have that point of view, it makes BCA a safe space, a trusted space. Black Cultural Archives was formed about 40 years ago by a group of activists, parents, educators who wanted to create that safe space for community, but also to correct the omissions and erasures from mainstream history, to actually show that we have had a presence, that we can be role models, that we achieve and that we contribute and that we're creative and we're not all of those stereotypes that have grown up through society, because racism is layered into every layer of society. So now that we are an institution, we opened the doors to our building, which is 1 Windrush Square, in 2014. We've started to understand that how we can behave is not entirely the same way that an individual grassroots activist group can behave, but we can use our active voice. And so that's why when the government invited us to join the new cross-government working group, we thought, well, that's completely our role, to use our active voice, to use our influence. But we haven't left behind our collective, collaborative, collegiate activist principles. And so we really see our role on that board as not just BCA's voice, but the voice of the rest of the community and activists who are all working towards this, including our colleagues on the panel today. So those are some opening remarks. I could talk probably all day on things like the 1971 Immigration Act and the hostile environment and how culture makes us human. And so culture is something that we need to really reinforce and think about actively. But I don't want to take up too much of the discussion time, so I'm going to pause on that and maybe we can return to some of those issues in the wider discussion. And I also wanted to say that I'm really happy to see the Young Historians Project on this call too. They're wonderful and they're really pushing things forward.
Thanks, Arike. I just also want to take a moment to thank the Mayor for joining us today. I know that you're incredibly busy and I believe you have to leave shortly. So thank you so much for joining us today and for your remarks earlier on, and for GLA's involvement in helping set this whole event up today. I'm going to hand over now to the Reverend Clive Foster to talk also similarly about the work that the Pilgrim Church is doing, the ongoing challenges about supporting, ensuring justice for individuals who were affected by the scandal, but also ensuring that it never happens again, and the lessons that we can all take from it. It's my pleasure to introduce Reverend Foster.
Thank you, Sat. Good morning, Lord Mayor. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here, and it's great that a moment like this continues to be visible, because the justice still needs to be approached, and it's really important that we continue to recognise the injustice that's been done to the Windrush generation. You know, here in Nottingham from the Pilgrim Church, it's led by Reverend Canon Christian Weaver, who's from Antigua. He's a policeman when he was in Antigua, came over as a part of the Windrush generation and set up, that great generation also came over, and we don't really hear this story and narrative, actually came over with great faith and belief, and they came to contribute to the nation, and they came with a great hope and their faith. And it was a result of that faith that they set up a number of black churches. Those churches provided the heart and the community for the black community. And in Nottingham, with our particular church, we've always been conscious of the importance of the whole person, spiritual, moral, and the physical. When the Windrush scandal broke, we felt it was so important that we spoke to our own congregation to say, come forward and speak to us if anyone feels concerned that you may be getting letters that are indicating you may have to be proving your status. When we gave that initial announcement, we were astonished how so many people came forward. People were coming forward and saying, Clive, I'm concerned about my father. I'm concerned about my uncle. His passport is still not sorted. We now know that the Windrush scandal, as a result of the Wendy Williams report, was foreseeable and avoidable. When we got to understand the number of people who were coming forward, it became clear to us that we had to act and react very quickly. And there were two things that quickly came to the fore that we knew we had to act on. Number one, there was a great amount of emotional and psychological trauma. People were scared and apprehensive. They were fearful. They didn't trust the Home Office, and they were hearing these reports that people were genuinely being denied access to services and being detained or deported. And number two, there was a lack of legal support. And that was really an issue for our community. It was so important that we had JCWI and people like Patrick Vernon in the legal profession who we could turn to, because I don't know if people remember, but even back then, when the Windrush scandal first broke, people were actually saying, don't contact the Home Office straight away, because if you do, you might get yourself in more trouble than you think. And so it was really important, we found, that as trusted grassroots organisations, we could communicate with our community with regards to engaging at the right level. And so it was important that we found partnership. And this was so important because there wasn't the ability to have the legal assistance. So we partnered with local immigration advisors who were had positive relationships with the church, and free pro bono, we put on these surgeries. We engaged professional counsellors from within the local community and within the church community. And so we tried to address the two areas that was coming to the fore as a result of the Windrush scandal. This sense of, why is this happening to me? I felt I was British. I believed I was British, and the trauma it was creating, and also providing the legal support. I do have to say that it's really important that we continue to look at the strength of building and enabling grassroots communities and the community to be sustainable, to support the communities through this challenge. We were getting so many stories where people were saying, I can't trust or go through to the Home Office because of everyone could have a story perhaps of someone who came over from the Caribbean or a relative where they had a bad experience. So what we recognized was the importance of actually having a trusted community leaders who can really navigate and support people who were affected by the Windrush scandal. I think going forward, I think there were two things I would like to say. I have to say I've been very disappointed with the lack of, as it were, advertising and engagement within the communities to effectively reach communities with regards to getting into the Windrush Task Force and also applying for compensation. I mean, I can get into my car and I switch on the radio and I can hear an advert about the EU citizens and other things, but I hear nothing to that scale about the Windrush task force and support. So engagement at that level needs to be addressed and looked at, and that's probably something that we can look at as well. And the second thing I would say really is going forward is the importance of supporting those community groups who were doing the on-ground work. The engagement is really important, and it's really important that we, the Home Office and people understand the amount of effort that is required to reach our people, and how that can be better resourced through having what we call either co-production and understanding the reach that we need to attain to get people, because we do know that the number of people who still need to come forward, we haven't reached it yet. It is still unknown the amount of people who are affected by this, but community-led, strengthened, resourced organisations to help in that engagement is going to be important. And I think what was important for us as well is that we had law students who saw the what was happening here, and they volunteered their services as well. And I would echo what one of our colleagues says earlier about the young people and the history. I think going forward, we need to continue to build on that and to recognise that this injustice is not only affecting the Windrush generation, but it's a stain on future generations and the present generation as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Reverend Foster. Our third panellist will be with us shortly. We're in the very rare occasion on which we are running ahead of schedule. Jackie will be joining us in about 15 minutes time. So I thought we'd begin.
Hello.
Oh, hello, Jackie, we've got you there.
Yes, no, I've been here all the time.
Oh,
I can only log on as an attendee though, so I can't, so that's why I'm having to do it via phone. But okay. I can see you and Clive and Arike.
Wonderful. Jackie, I guess we'll go to you then for your thoughts and comments on the ongoing fight for justice, the challenges that are facing members of the Windrush generation, and where you see the work that is necessary to move that process forward, where you see the sort of rays of hope and challenges, I guess.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. Firstly, I must apologise because I'm not quite sure why I can't actually get onto the screen other than as an attendee. So I do apologise for that. Secondly, I'd like to thank JCWI and the Mayor and his office, the GLA, for hosting a conference, or a meeting rather, on the Windrush scandal, because 2 years in, people are still suffering and are still traumatised, and it's important that even though this is Windrush Day and it's meant to be about celebration of the achievements of the Windrush generation, that we keep at the forefront of our views and thoughts the fact that there is still an ongoing injustice that really does need to be resolved. So I'm really grateful to all of you for putting on this event today. As the chair said, I'm Jacqueline McKenzie, and I run a law firm called McKenzie, Boter and Pope, which has been really quite involved in dealing with cases pertaining to the Windrush scandal. And that's because we only do immigration, asylum and refugee law. And around 10 years ago, we started to see these cases where people from, I suppose, mainly, the older generation from the Caribbean were coming to us without status documents. And of course, then nobody sort of determined or recognized the nature of the issue. We were simply getting people to naturalize, and that was costing them quite a lot of money. And then in 2015, I ran a training seminar for the CARICOM High Commissioners. Those are the diplomats that represent all the Caribbean countries. And this issue came up, and they actually undertook, the Dominican High Commissioner, Janet Charles, actually wrote to the Home Office to say that, the people who came to the UK, no reference to Windrush at all, but we were referencing it indirectly without even knowing it. Her letter describes these people who came to the UK in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and early 70s, were without status and were having to spend thousands of pounds naturalising, i.e. obtaining a status which they all thought they had. and she got no response. So we do know, we have absolute evidence that the Home Office and the British government, because the Foreign and Commonwealth Office was also involved, were put on notice that this was an issue. So I would imagine the participants to today are all very, very familiar with what the Windrush scandal is. So no need in the very short time that I've got to go through it. But I was actually asked specifically to look at whether the Windrush Lessons Learned review was comprehensive, and would it be a force for real change? In terms of the work, and I have to declare an interest because I was a member of the independent advisory group of it. In terms of the work that was done, it was an extremely comprehensive exercise. Well, I mean, most of you will be familiar with the fact that it took, almost 2 years to do. The team, which was made up of Home Office officials as well as this independent advisory group and other experts, looked at 20,000 documents. 450 members of the Home Office staff and other staff were interviewed. 270 victims were interviewed, and there were a series of ethnographic studies looking into detail at some of the horrific cases that you see going through the thread of the Windrush Lessons Learned review document. And so from that respect, and of course, there was a lot of engagement. There was lots of community activities and meetings and seminars, and also an open call for people to submit evidence. So the information was the work that was undertaken was quite far-reaching in the way that these things go. And you will see that there are 30 recommendations requiring the Home Office to produce an implementation plan by the 20th of September 2020. And those recommendations themselves go to culture of the Home Office, the operations, and the sorts of issues that caused, the scandal in the first place. But what it doesn't do, there was a finding that tenets of the operations had the features of institutional racism, but that in itself, it wasn't institutionally racist. And that's been picked up on quite a lot by the media. And there's a misunderstanding there, because all that is actually saying it was impossible to find that within the definition as per the Macpherson definition. But really and truly, if you are saying that there are aspects of behavior that are institutionally racist, and you're saying something is institutionally racist as far as I'm concerned. And so my interest is piqued now that we have this incredible momentum and movement towards, looking at what is it that's causing all these inequalities in society. The fact that against all indices of measurement, whether it's health, as we're seeing with COVID-19, or employment and education, the criminal justice system, that racism rears its head and affects the quality of people's lives in quite a devastating way. And therefore, it's very important to me that the Lessons Learned review, the aspects of it that talk about racism, must be highlighted and examined more closely. And I've just recently been asked to do a 5,000-word article for an academic journal on this. And so I've been having to go really deep into what it says. And we certainly haven't got time. I'd be here for the next 2 hours if I was to try and do that today. But the review really does focus, even though it touches on some of the legislative issues, it really does focus on the operations of the Home Office, the inability of staff to be flexible, a lot of the sorts of issues that the JCWI themselves always pick up on. The right to rent policy, the fact that staff aren't properly trained, unconscious bias, all those sorts of things. But what it doesn't do, it kind of lets the government, and not just the current government, but past governments of both major parties, it sort of lets them off the hook in my mind, because a lot of this is actually ideological. Of course, there are going to be people in the Home Office who have a particular ideology themselves, and may well, I mean, I think they're going to be a reflection of society. And we saw with that report done by the Oxford Migration Observatory just a few years ago, 2017, I believe it was, that said 10% of respondents didn't mind more migrants coming in from Australia, but 37% minded more migrants coming in from Nigeria. So we know that in immigration policy, ideologically, and also across the society, that racism is underpinning it. And I think, therefore, as we are now all focused on how racism is underpinning almost every aspect of the lives of African and Caribbean and Asian people in this country, but some groups worse than others, I think it's really important to put the governments, including or the political parties, to task, or hold them to task on what are effectively extremely racist immigration policies. So, you know, we always preface the Windrush scandal in the paradigm of speeches by Enoch Powell and Margaret Thatcher and Theresa May with her hostile environment. But recently I came across something, and I know I haven't got much time and I am going to wind up very soon, but I came across this very recently. The British people fortunately enjoy a profound unity without uniformity in their way of life, and are blessed by the absence of a colour racial problem. An influx of coloured people domiciled here is likely to impair the harmony, strength and cohesion of a public and social life, and to cause discord and unhappiness among all concerned. Now, this was a letter that's been found in an archive, and it wasn't signed. The letter is actually dated the 22nd of June, 1948. It was the actual date that the Windrush docked at Tilbury. And it was, you know, and so I thought when I saw this letter that it was going to be signed by somebody like Enoch Powell. So, but it was actually signed by 11 Labour MPs and sent to Clement Attlee, Labour Prime Minister, who at the time was thinking that the Windrush boat shouldn't be allowed to dock, but instead should be rerouted to East Africa, and that the Caribbean migrants on board it, free people, you know, slavery had long since been abolished, but that they should go off and work on a ground nut picking job somewhere over in East Africa. And this was Labour. So we've got a real problem in that all the parties, the major parties, see immigration as an issue that they don't really want to confront in a fair way. And of course, you know, some bits of ideologies is more sympathetic, but generally speaking, they're both as bad as each other, because they both recognize that it's a rich picking, you know, it flames the flames of racial resentment, and there's no votes to be won by being pro-migrant. I mean, there are some very notable heavyweights in some of the more radical and left of centre parties who said very little about Windrush, even though Windrush captured the imagination of everybody, including people on the right, or you know, in the right-wing media. But there were still politicians on the left who were too frightened to touch it because it was immigration. And we saw this too with Brexit, and we saw it certainly in the last election. So I think that I think the Windrush Lessons Learned review is a really important document that we will be thumbing through for a very, very long time. We've now also got the Equalities and Human Rights Commission 2 years late, in my opinion, because we had spoken to them at the outset. But nevertheless, I think Black Lives Matter has catalysed everybody and made them realise that this is serious and they've got to do some work. So they're now going to examine whether the Home Office has breached their public duty under the Equality Act. So that's very good. But really and truly, to make change, for this Lessons Learned review to be meaningful, the recommendations that deal with culture and operations are one thing, but we've also got to take a look at the laws that came about and that they are racist in their design. I mean, we know from 1968 that there was laws that particularly disadvantaged people from what was called the new Commonwealth, i.e. black people, whereas people from the old Commonwealth, Australia and New Zealand and Canada, came under a different regime. So I think we've got to be bold, and we've got to say that this is racism. I also think, and I'm going to finish here, because I'm very involved in running Windrush surgeries through the Black Cultural Archives, through my office, and around the country. I've gone all around the country doing Windrush surgeries. I'm still doing Windrush surgeries on Skype. During lockdown, I've seen over probably 800 victims of the Windrush scandal. So I believe that I have a fair view of what is going on. And I think that when we look at the problems that are ongoing, so for instance, there are issues with people who haven't been given status documents or a declaration that they're a British citizen because they've got criminal convictions. We've seen real difficulties with the operation of the hardship fund, where we had that case at Christmas of Chiplin Burton, who had been brought back to the UK wrongly, kept out of the UK, brought back from Jamaica after £500 for winter clothing, or warm clothing rather, and she got an email from somebody in the Home Office asking her, what does she mean by warm clothing? And we've seen the compensation scheme. Now, I've always said the issue isn't so much the scheme or the design of the scheme, it's the implementation of it. It is extremely slow, and it is cumbersome in terms of the amount of evidence rather, that people need to adduce in order to make a claim. And also, it's the sort of scheme that not a lot of people are going to be able to make a claim, because you've actually got to show a demonstrable loss. So there are real ongoing problems, and the reason why I link the ongoing problems to racism and the history as to where we are at the moment and how we got there, and all the bits in the middle that we've not had time to talk about, is because I think that the community who are mostly affected by the Windrush scandal, we know it's a Commonwealth, and and I've had people from Canada and New Zealand actually approach me for assistance, but overwhelmingly from the Home Office's own data, it is people from the Caribbean who are overwhelmingly Black people, and even more so, it's overwhelmingly Jamaicans. And when you look at 2 years on that people still haven't got justice and that there are still problems, I think that racism that we heard in that letter from those 11 MPs, and the letters that were written by Enoch Powell, and the hostile environment policy of both Labour and of both the Conservative, is still very much alive today. I think the community are treated with such contempt. I mean, I actually saw a minute somewhere from the 1950s where somebody said that they didn't think that these people were going to come and stay anyway. They'd come and help rebuild the country. And it's poignant that today's Windrush Day, and we're discussing this because we're not just discussing the scandal, but there's also the issue about who these people are and why they came and what they did when they got here. And a lot of them thought coming from Jamaica or Barbados or Grenada to the UK was no different from somebody coming from Liverpool, Birmingham or Manchester to London. They thought they were coming to a part of the territory that they belonged to. They thought they were British, and they were coming to just another part of their own territory, and to be treated the way they were. And for that treatment to be ongoing, 2 years on, says that we do need to look beyond the recommendations, and those recommendations are important and must be implemented. And I'm quite pleased that the Home Secretary has given a commitment to producing the plan in time. But I think there are problems. I think there are real problems. We see today the announcement of a new Windrush working group. I think that in itself is problematic, because if you look at the makeup of the group, if it is meant to discuss the serious issues that are underpinning the problems of the inequalities in the society, like mental health and physical health and education, employment, economy, criminal justice, housing, I don't see a single expert on that panel. So what is the purpose of that panel? It is extremely worrying. And then it's going to produce yet another review. And we already know that we've got loads. I started off, my first job in the UK was in 1986 as a race equality officer in the London Borough of Hackney. I worked on reviews then, and there were reviews going back to the 50s. In fact, there was a review after the race riots in Cardiff in 1919, and these are all sitting in filing cabinets somewhere. So what we want, and what I hope, is that this review panel that's been set up today is going to be given some real teeth and some real power to effect change. But I also hope that everybody else across the society is going to see the Windrush scandal for what it really is, i.e. racism, and look at what is going on now with the movement around Black Lives and so on, and really try in all of our organizations and across all the themes to really make a difference, and not just to keep talking about it and having reviews and setting up panels and giving people jobs. We've got to find a way of making real change. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jackie, and apologies to everybody watching that you had to look at me for the duration of that as Jackie was joining us by the phone. I've been having a look at some of these questions which have come in over here in the Q&A box, and if you are watching and you'd like to put a question to our panel, please do use that over there. We can see them as they come in, and then we'll be able to hand them over quite quickly. We've got a few that have been upvoted quite quickly already. A few people in our audience today are asking about the status of Windrush Day as a national holiday, and I won't ask our panel if they think that it should be a national holiday, because I can imagine perhaps what your answers might be. What I'll ask instead is, if we are to make Windrush Day part of our kind of societal fabric, this is something that we mark every year, and that local authorities, governments, communities invest in making this day a day of commemoration or a day of memory. What should that look like? What should Windrush Day look like in 5 years, or perhaps in 10 years? And I'll throw that to any of the panelists who'd like to have the first go at that.
I can have so in 5 or 10 years, what would Windrush Day look like? I think that we should be really visionary about what it should look like. And actually, I think that's a great question, because we should decide that now, and then we should make it happen. So the first official Windrush Day last year, BCA, Black Cultural Archives, we had an exhibition that ran in the summer that was a discursive exhibition looking at the progress of legislation and how we got to the hostile environment. Most of the funded Windrush Day activities were more about celebrating culture. And this year, I really feel like the balance is more equal between the celebrating and the discursive, and actually thinking about, as Jackie was talking about, that the Windrush scandal is racism. It is. And so for how Windrush is celebrated in 5 years, I am dreaming that the discursive nature is not still going to be about access to compensation and institutional inequality, but it will be about how we have moved policy and progress, and it will be about the achievements that we've managed to make while still addressing, because racism has been with us for hundreds of years now, so it's obviously not going to go overnight. But now that we are starting to make progress, I feel like Windrush Day, each celebration, has to be about education and activism and celebration.
Thanks, Arike. Clive, Reverend Foster, do you have any thing to add about what Windrush Day should look like in 5 years or perhaps 10 years' time?
Well, we have some magnificent stories and people from the Windrush generation, and we need to be creatively capturing those stories. I have seen in Nottinghamshire there is the Holocaust Centre, and they've got this, as we know, the obviously people from who suffered in the Second World War, the Jews, are now obviously dying out. And one of the things that they've got in Nottingham, the Holocaust Centre, they've got like this hologram where you can actually interact and talk. And so they're capturing the stories of the survivors, and then they're creating this kind of a hologram whereby you can sort of speak to the person and they'll tell their story. And I think for me, what I'm saying is that the Windrush generation There are so many great stories of the Windrush generation in the UK, their contribution to our various industries. And I think even locally, you can get these stories. You can get these stories in where people from the Windrush generation, and I don't think we should undersell them or underplay them. Talk about the people who worked in the NHS, talk about the people who worked in the public sector, talk about the people who worked in the schools. And also, I think 5 years on, what we should be building on is making the connection to the British UK Black people and the Windrush generation. So look what Marcus Rashford did. Look how Raheem Sterling is talking about. So that's just to name two high-profile people. But I think that we have a number of Windrush descendants who are now making history, and I think they should be categorized and also as going forward as well as part of celebrating the Windrush Day in the UK as well.
Thank you. Jackie, I don't know if you can still hear. Are you still
Yes.
with us? Wonderful. So the question to the panel was, where do you see and what do you see Windrush Day looking like in 5 years or perhaps 10 years time?
I mean, it's a really interesting question. What I'd like to see is a more equal society, and that there could be a celebration of everybody, all cultures, all communities joining in the celebration of a community that represents Windrush Day. But I fear that that's not really going to be the case. I think Clive is right that it's important to continue to celebrate the success stories. But I do think that there's some limitations to that, in that, you see the same stories all the time. These lovely nurses, or, these people who came in and helped on the underground, or, the railways and so on. And I don't think, and I think that that's part of the problem, really, when we're talking about wanting to shift the narrative and making sure that the history is properly understood. I think the history has to be understood full scale, or taught full scale, so that we get those, what I call the nice cozy stories, and not underplaying. Both my parents represent both those things, nurses and the railways, when they first arrived. So I'm not underplaying, and I know how hard they work. I'm not certainly underplaying those functions, but our community is so much more than that. And there are the problems, as I alluded to earlier, in terms of the racism that caused us to have laws and to have such major inequalities. And I'd like to see in a bit of what we're doing today in this conference, unlike a lot of the events that are happening today. I don't think that we can just be having the tea parties and the celebrations. I think we need to keep on, and it will take more than 5 years, having discussions about how we shift the inequalities in society. And if the review team, and I think the review team is just one thing, really, and but we need other teams and other organizations to be doing things. And I think it will be good on Windrush Day for me to have almost a sort of state of the nation address on what has happened to the Windrush community. Has there been any advances, any ironing out of the inequalities that continue not just to plague the first generation, but their great-grandchildren? Has there been any changes in the legislation that continue to cause these inequalities? Have there been any statistics or data that says, Black youth are less likely to be stop and searched, or less likely to get a custodial sentence when compared in the same situation of an offence to a white offender? I'd like to be able to see some real data each Windrush Day that assesses and analyses, is anything changing where the Windrush community is concerned, in addition to all the celebrations of all the positive things. But I think we focus far too much on those things, and there's some serious work to be done.
Thanks, Jackie. Is Patrick still with us? I can't see him on here. I think we've temporarily at least lost Patrick. But the points you raise are really interesting, and they segue sort of quite neatly into the next question, which I've got lined up here in the Q&A box, which is about we've got somebody over here is asking. He says the scandal of an entire generation of Black people is diluted when we refer to it as the Windrush scandal, because we draw people's attention to a single boat and a single moment in time, and he's asking if we would be better placed referring to the Windrush scandal as a much wider spread civil rights scandal, as an issue which predates the arrival of the Windrush and continues to exist, I suppose, long after the promises have been made and the apologies have been offered by governments. And so from that, what I'd like to ask panelists is how we hold these two conversations at the same time. We have a conversation about the incredible contribution that's been made to the country by people from all over the world, and on today of all days, particularly people from the Caribbean who came to this country at the end of the war, and there's a generally widespread lack of understanding of that contribution, and celebrating that is part of creating a new history for this country. But at the same time, when we do that, we make it even harder for some groups of people who may not fit that neat story. Jackie talked about people with criminal records, for example, who meet all of the other criteria but are unable to become citizens, are unable to access that paperwork, and so that work becomes much more difficult. How do we hold on to these two conversations at the same time? It's a bit of a curveball, but I'm just trying to bridge a couple of these questions that we've got here together. And I can see Clive is nodding, so I'll hand over to Clive first.
Can I, sorry, Sadiq and Clive, I'm really sorry to do this, but I have to go because I should have been in another conference. I accidentally double booked. Can I just make a comment on that? Because I really do have to leave, yes. Although I may be able to come back on.
Go ahead, Jackie, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to say that when we talk about the Windrush generation, we are not just talking about people who came on the boat, or even the people who came between 1948 and 1973. We are talking about the children that we see marching at the moment, demanding the justices that their parents and grandparents have been denied. It is the entire community. The name is a misnomer, but it is just the name. If we called it something else, the injustices would still be there. It doesn't matter what we call it. And I get this a lot. People say to me, well, why is it called this? And it's excluding, people who came from this part of the world, or it's excluding certain generations here. That's irrelevant. It doesn't matter what we call it. The real thing is, how are we going to effect change? What are we going to do? Each and every one of us, but also systemically, how are we going to get the community, how are we going to address these serious inequalities that we're seeing, 72 years on from the docking of that boat, when all these people came with these dreams and their aspirations and their skills, funnily enough, because there's also this view that everybody came because they were desperate and had to come here. A lot of the people who came from my mother's country were teachers. My mother was a teacher and came here and her qualifications wasn't recognized. So it's not just it's about how do we look at all the generations that are here and what is the real wrong that's been done to them. And the real wrong that's been done to them is they've not had an equal opportunity to thrive. And how are we going to address that now in a serious way? Because we've had lots and lots of focus on this, lots of reviews, lots of reports, all very, very good work. I'm not knocking any of the reports and reviews and bodies and so on that have been looking at this, but it's never really translated into more than little bits of action of certain people getting jobs, or maybe a couple more magistrates, a couple more judges, but it's not affecting the system. And I don't know how we do it, but I think that's the conversation that needs to happen now.
Thanks, Jackie. And in case you do have to jump off from this call, thank you so much for joining us today and for your contribution, as well as all of the incredible work that you're doing with the Windrush community, the work you've done with the Windrush Lessons Learned review. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you. And can I just also say that thank you to JCWI for supporting the work that the Centre for Migration Advice Research, Mackenzie Boter and Pope, and the BCA do to help all the victims of the financial support and other support to help the victims of the Windrush scandal attend surgeries as a result of the funding that was raised by Patrick Vernon and match funded by the GLA and managed by yourself. So we're really grateful to all of you, because it has made a big difference, even though we've been working without any resources for 2 years, and these resources have only really come on stream recently, and they're quite small relatively, but they have enabled us to get 1 or 2 extra people in to help, because the work is onerous and the injustices are still quite major. Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. Clive, you were about to say something a short while ago.
Yes, I want to go back to that question about this defining of the Windrush generation and the Windrush scandal and the other elements of injustice. First of all, I want to make the point that the Windrush generation in the UK, amongst many of the Black communities, has always been celebrated for a number of years. It's really important to make that statement that before the Windrush scandal broke, communities were celebrating the Windrush generation. And, we did this in our own towns and cities and whatever, and to, very small scale or very big scale, depending on how we did it. So it's important to make that point, because I think what obviously transpired, which we now know, is as a result of the Windrush scandal, a lot of people became just aware of who the Windrush generation were and what they did. So I think in that regard, it has brought more attention and focus to a generation who contributed, as we know, so much, and why we have Windrush Day. I would say that even even in our own community, it's very interesting how the definition of the Windrush generation in terms of legislation and people having to access the status and also to access the compensation has been very much defined by the Home Office. And so we've had people who come up to us and they are very much Windrush, but because they see this paperwork and the definition of Windrush according to the eligibility for status and compensation, they're like saying, am I Windrush? So you better believe you're Windrush. You are. And so I think there is this defining that has come through the scandal, and we need to remember the more holistic approach in terms of people from the Commonwealth as well. So, I mean, the stable door has already been open, hasn't it? And so the definition is already there. I don't think I think we need to be bringing, and I think JCWI has been very skillful in doing this, actually bringing the other areas of the injustice associated with immigration and bringing those to the table as well, and making those links and tying them together and making the case and strengthening the case, because I think something that does need to happen is the allies and alliances around this as well, because I'm sad to say, even when we had the EU citizens and the Brexit debate, I remember seeing in the European Parliament, when they were talking about EU citizens, someone standing up from one of the European MPs and saying, well, I just hope they don't treat us like the Windrush. It got to that level. So I think the power is what Jackie was saying is I don't think we should be drawing back from calling it the Windrush scandal, but also we should be making those connections, but most importantly seeking for the justice and then aligning it to other injustices which can amplify the need for change.
Arike, do you have anything to add?
I do. On naming, I think some of the reason that Windrush as a term has really captured the popular imagination is, even though there were ships that arrived before the Windrush ship, even though there have been people of African descent living in this country for 2,000 years and people of Caribbean and African descent for much longer than the Windrush ship's arrival. I think one of the reasons why the Windrush ship itself caught the public attention, and something that we shouldn't forget when we're talking about making a change to institutional and systemic racism, is that it was the Windrush ship's landing cards which were the ones that were shredded. So 1,027 landing cards shredded. And when those people arrived, which we also shouldn't forget, before 1948, any British subject was allowed to travel and settle in the UK. And then the 1948 Act was to some extent a kind of way of enshrining those rights in legislation. But before the 1948 migration that was bringing a lot of Black and brown people to this country, they didn't feel the need to enshrine it. But so they were kind of thinking, right, we'll actually have to start legislating about this because the doors are too open. And subsequent legislation from that act leading up to the hostile environment has dismantled and dismantled and dismantled and taken away those rights. So when we're talking about the landing cards being shredded, the people on that ship didn't really know that they would have to keep all of this paperwork, which is now being asked for, because when they arrived, they were British citizens and they had the right to live and settle in the country that gave its name to the empire. So that little bit, because that is such a bizarre and blatant act, I think that's why the word Windrush has captured a wider swathe of the popular imagination and has moved beyond our communities and beyond people who are interested in history, and has actually managed to penetrate the public consciousness. And I think there is a usefulness in having those things that can penetrate through the public consciousness. And I absolutely agree that we mustn't then allow it to become something that's just noise, that just has outlived its usefulness and allows people to, dismiss it to it's Windrush. So it definitely needs us to keep on top of the issue and to keep finding ways to make sure that the wider public understand what's going on here, what the real issues are. And I also wanted to note as well that Black Cultural Archives, obviously to Clive's point from earlier in the discussion, we do collect the histories of our communities, and today for the first time we have some of the oral histories of Windrush Generation available on our website, and it's for the first time that these have been available. So I just came from another event before this one, hosted by the Radiate Windrush Festival, which is an amazing community festival that happens each year, and this year it's online, and we had a listening party to some of those oral histories, and it's a really broad range of experience. So I do recommend that you listen to them. But also, I'm really excited that we've been able to make them available, because it shows that broadness, that diversity of experience that we're talking about, that Windrush isn't this catch-all term. It's not the new BAME. So those are my few comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Arike. We've got, I think, 10 minutes before we move on to our next session. So I'm just going to pick one or at most two more questions from here. One that perhaps, Arike, you'll be best placed to start us off with, is about teaching in schools and the work. What do you think the work looks like, or what do we need to do to ensure that Black British history is taught in mainstream schools so that all people are aware of the history? And this is from Councillor Robert Johnson, who submitted this question today.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson. This has been something that people have been campaigning for years and years and years and years. The last time there was a review of the curriculum, the Black and Asian Studies Association, BASA, sent a very comprehensive curriculum plan to Michael Gove, and it wasn't taken on. I think it was at the same time that the Holocaust was temporarily taken off the curriculum and then hastily put back on the curriculum. And I think that kind of shows that sometimes the curriculum can be a bit of a political football. So what we do need to figure out is a way to keep Black history in schools. A lot of teachers want to teach it. There are resources that have been made over time that teachers could access, but it's not going to be examined on. So it's difficult for teachers to prioritise teaching it if it's not going to be in the exams. So that's, you know, a lot of teachers teach towards what's going to be on the AQA, what's going to be on the edXL or what have you, the other exam boards. So while teachers actually are allowed to teach Black British history in schools because the history curriculum is not statutory, they have very little motivation. So again, it's to do with that systemic governmental change that needs to happen, a change in point of view. It's not about, you know, making a curriculum that is branded by the current government, and then if another party comes into power, then they're like, oh, we want to change that to make it a bit more ours. It's about really changing the point of view and giving the power to teachers and the breathing space to teachers to enable them to teach, because the resources are out there. We teach a lot of schools that come into our building. I know other organisations do as well. Yeah. Again, I could like go on and on, so I'm trying to like not to do short answers.
Clive, you've touched on this issue around education and storytelling. What do you see as the necessary steps for making sure that Black history is part of what all of us learn growing up in the UK?
Well, I think we've got to be a bit more radical with regards to this now, actually. I think we are seeing, and as a result of the Black Lives Matter, and we're seeing this even with the statues that were pulled down. I tell you now, the majority of people had never heard of Colston and wasn't aware of what he stood for. So many thousands of people would have walked by him, and even in our national consciousness, we weren't aware of it. And that even in Nottingham, I was in a meeting yesterday. There are churches who've got centuries old, and they're talking about, wow, we've got monuments that are, and the slave owners. And so one of the things, I mean, I think Arike has touched upon it in terms of rightly saying that there's been lots of campaigns and debates in pushing this agenda to tackle Black history within our curriculum. I think we need to be looking at making it more mandatory, to be honest with you. The idea of where it can just be rejected. Somehow we have to get to a point where Black history is seen as part of world history, UK history. I mean, I come from an age whereby when I was at school, the only history of Black people was some grainy picture, cartoon picture of slaves. That was my history of Black people at school. That's how it shows how old I am as well. But I know it's moved on now, but I think if we don't get to a point whereby, and it's good that it's in the national debate and consciousness now, and I've seen a number of petitions going around about decolonizing the curriculum, introducing Black history. I think there has to be, as was suggested, the political will, but this is good for everybody. I don't think we should be seeing this as just it's part of one section of the community. It's telling the story of world history. And I think the more that we move it towards what I would like to see much more mandatory, I think the better it is, because I think we are seeing, even on the back of the Black Lives Matter, the importance of understanding history, structural racism, and where it's coming from, because what is affecting us now has a history. And Black people didn't build that history of structural racism. And so it's going to be important that equally we know that history. And I think the school curriculum and decolonizing the curriculum is going to be an important marker and step in doing that and taking us forward.
Thanks, Clive. I just want to give a final check to see if Patrick's with us anywhere, because I know that he would want to weigh in on these questions, but I can't find him. I can't hear him or see him. All right. Well, we'll thank our guests for this incredible discussion. It's been a real pleasure and honour to join you to listen for the last short while. I wish we could carry on talking for another 3 or 4 or 5 hours, but I know you've also got other events as well today. It's still something that takes some getting used to, not being able to invite the audience to give a warm hand of applause at the end of a panel. So we'll move on with that to the next session that we've got penciled in for today, which is a spotlight on the Young Historians group. Now, the Young Historians is a non-profit organisation that was set up by young people working with young people to encourage the development of young historians of African and Caribbean heritage in Britain. There are alarmingly low numbers of history students and teachers from African and Caribbean heritage, and that has no doubt helped to contribute to the widespread lack of understanding among all communities of the role that African and Caribbean people have played in this country's history for hundreds of years, as well as the sort of general ignorance that we're seeing now popping up in the news, that we're seeing being debated more widely about the effects and actions and deliberate nature of empire, slavery and racism that has led us to today. Young historians encourage young people to rediscover their history, to engage in the study and the understanding of history so that they can become the historians of the future. It's incredibly important and valuable work. We're really, really glad to have you with us. I'm going to hand over now to Lamisha Ruddock and Ijeoma Peter, who I can't see if I've got everybody here because I can only see myself on my screen, but I think we do. I'm told we do. So I'll hand over to you and thank you for joining us today.
Hi, my name is Ijeoma and I'm a member of the Young Historians Project. As was mentioned earlier, we are a non-profit organisation formed by young people and we encourage the development of young historians of African and Caribbean descent in the UK. So we emerged as one of the outcomes of History Matters in 2015. And that was a conference that discussed why there were so few history students and teachers of African and Caribbean descent in the UK. In fact, there were only, in 2015, only 3 Black students admitted to train as history teachers. And history was the 3rd most unpopular subject amongst Black undergraduates. So as a group, YHP, we encourage people to engage with history and to learn about Black history and the contributions that Black people have made to the UK. So I think the work that we do is very important, and I'm thankful for the platform we have today to be able to share with you and inform you about the work we do. So our first project was on the Black Liberation Front, and undoubtedly Windrush has changed British society and has diversified our population. And this made ideas about racism and a Black identity in Britain that we couldn't ignore. And the Black Liberation Front was founded in 1971, and it changed or had a significant impact on the Black British political landscape, as well as playing a key role in Black communities. So they created community bookshops, had supplementary schools. They provided affordable housing for Black families, such as the Jumma Housing Association, as well as providing support for Black prisoners. And they did this not just in London, but across Britain. And with this movement, it helped to develop a Pan-African consciousness and a Black British political, sort of consolidated a Black British political identity. And I feel like the BLF did a lot to challenge the impact that racism had in Britain. For that project, we created a short film called We Are Our Own Liberators, and that is available on our website, www.younghistoriansproject.org. So today, as we celebrate 72 years since Windrush, it also marks 72 years since the formation of the NHS. And we all know how important the Windrush generation was to the formation and the staffing of the NHS. Many people answered the call to help rebuild Britain after the Second World War. So our current project is on African women and the British Healthcare Service from 1930 to the year 2000. So despite the long history of African women and the British healthcare system, very little is ever mentioned or highlighted about them in discussions about the NHS or healthcare in general. And I myself work in the NHS as a radiographer, so it's been very fascinating learning about people like Princess Sahai of Ethiopia, who trained as a nurse at Great Ormond Street Hospital. And it's just been so fascinating learning about these people. And she did that in the 1930s, so before the formation of the NHS. So that project is due to be completed by the end of this year. And I look forward to sharing with you what we've been discovering over the last 2 years. So I'm just going to hand over to my colleague Lamisha, who's going to talk about the work we've been doing in schools.
So hi, I'm Lamisha. So one major output for our project are school workshops. And obviously we're not able to be there in person due to social distancing policy. So our school workshop team have been working hard to create online workbooks. And this means that we're imploring any teacher who want to use our workbooks or get involved, help to consult with us, definitely get in contact with us. And I found that the lockdown situation means that extracurricular activities, interests have been put on a back burner. And I don't think that's okay in the sense that we should be promoting this kind of history that's not on the curriculum and when it should be on the curriculum anyway. And we're working hard so that all children can receive it. So this could be those who don't have a computer or a printer or just anything. It's surprising the numbers of students who don't have a computer, and I think that's something we need to rectify. So the workbook is based on our current project on African women in the health sector, and it includes sections on social policy, primary sources, oral history, and we've been lucky that we've been in consultation with some teachers already. So they're helping us understand how workbooks should be formed for students, because we're young people ourselves, so we want to make sure that it's accessible to students, because the kind of research we've done is far more extensive than what they can digest. So we want to make sure it's accessible and just fun to do, in the sense that we want to make history fun. But our project is far from over, so we're still on the look for African women to interview. And this could be anyone who worked in the health sector from 1930 to 2000. This could be nurses, doctors, radiographers, janitors, receptionists, anyone who worked in the health sector. We're also looking for mural spaces in hospitals. We've currently got Charing Cross Hospital on board, but we want as many hospitals as possible all across Britain, because these women deserve the recognition. They genuinely deserve the recognition that they just don't have right now. But at the heart of YHP is the aim to promote history as a discipline to young people of African and Caribbean heritage. So we're still looking for people to join YHP and spark their interest in history, which I feel like YHP has sparked in me. But why are we here today? Windrush, 1948. It marked a turning point in Black British history as society rapidly diversified and became multicultural, especially in London. But I cannot stress enough how we need to look at Black British history through a social lens. It's needed for greater understanding of individual experiences to help you understand the reality they lived in as a person, not just a statistic. Windrush, it's by no means the start of our history, but certainly for many, it's the start of their engagement in Black British history. I just finished my first year at university, and it confuses me how many of my peers don't know about the Black Panthers in the UK, about Olive Morris, about the Bristol bus boycott, about the murder of Kelso Coltrane, the Mangrove Nine, the New Cross house fire, the fact that we had a colour bar that was only rectified with the Race Relations Act, which came a year after the US Civil Rights Act of '64, a year after. There needs to be a whole reassessment of Black British history, and it needs to be a priority because it shaped this illusion that we have of Britain. I hope we go further in providing enough resources, research, promotion of Black British history in society, because sometimes it really feels like I'm living a different reality to many. If you want to find out more about the Young Historians Project, please check out our website, which includes our previous project, as stated before. Also, email us, younghistoriansproject@gmail.com. Find us on Instagram at Young Historians Project. Find us on Twitter, YHP_UK, and find us on Facebook by searching our name. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lamisha and Ijeoma. It's great to hear more about your work. I've been following it closely. Everybody watching, please visit younghistoriansproject.org, or as they've said, follow them on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, look up their work, find ways to support it. It's my pleasure to introduce our final spotlight for the day, the work of Chrisanne Jarrett and We Belong. We Belong was born out of a project called Let Us Learn, which campaigned with a huge amount of impact for the rights of young people who have migrated here to the UK to access higher education and to have equal access to education with their peers who have British citizenship, and to make it easier for young people to access citizenship. We Belong is a path-breaking organisation that's been born out of that project and has a vision for young migrants to be treated equally and fairly in our society. It fights to enter a hostile environment and to make citizenship and higher education more accessible. It's my pleasure to introduce Chrisanne, who's here to speak about the work of We Belong.
Perfect, thank you. I'm sure everyone can hear me. So my name is Chrisanne, and I'm really grateful to be invited to speak here today, and happy Windrush Day. As I mentioned, we still have a long way to go, so not all celebrations. So I'm co-founder and co-CEO of We Belong, the first UK-wide charity to be set up and ran entirely by and for young migrants. We work with young people between the ages of 16 to 25 from non-EEA countries, many from Commonwealth countries that moved here at very young age as children but have precarious status. We campaign for the rights of young migrants, as Sadiq has said, to be treated equally and fairly in the society that they call home. We have a membership of just over 1,300 young people, and we have 3 projects. Let Us Learn, the first project focusing on equal access to higher education, working with over 20 schools in London to ensure that teachers and young people know about the barriers they may face in accessing higher education as a result of their status. Our Leadership Academy to develop young people's authentic styles of leadership, and finally Chasing Status, which aims to remove, call an end to the hostile environment. And we really believe in the power of storytelling and lived experience to really anchor recommendations for change and drive reform to our immigration system. I have 3 things I wanted to speak about today. The first is the parallels between young migrants and the Windrush generation. The second is how the hostile environment affects young migrants, with specific focus on the extortionate fees to regularization and citizenship. The third and final point is, moving forward, how can we ensure that people aren't left behind? So the first thing, what are the parallels between young migrants and the Windrush generation? So firstly, major point of difference, unlike the Windrush generation, we were not invited here. We came here as children in the early 2000s with our families, lawfully migrating here, and have lived here ever since. But when the Windrush scandal hit, it created shockwaves within our community. We thought it odd that those invited here, those who were settled here and are undoubtedly British, could be treated in this way. And as the stories broke and exposed the ruining of many lives, deportation and no relief, we asked ourselves, what would be our fate? Like the Windrush generation, we have spent our formative years in the UK, made friends here, our values shaped here, some of us since the age of 2, the UK being the only home that we have. But the indiscriminate nature of the hostile environment means that our future are made uncertain. Without lawful status, young people, there's a risk that this generation will be a generation of lost potential. Young people aren't able to access higher education, work, open bank accounts, rent housing, and just live normal lives. And so their social integration is hampered further once they reach the age of 18. So this is personal for me, and I started campaigning for this in 2014. I came to the UK, was born in Jamaica, came here at the age of 8 in 2002 to be with my mom. And my mom did everything possible. She ticked all the right boxes, had the lawyers, and also submitted applications for us to regularize our status. In 2007, she submitted an application for indefinite leave to remain, and we didn't hear back from the Home Office until 2012, where they stated that they'd lost all our paperwork, and unfortunately, we had to start again. So it's personal for me because it's, you see, when the Home Office makes a mistake, they apologise. We are the unintended consequences of very hostile policies. But apologies aren't enough. If they make a mistake, if we make a mistake, we're unable to and are unable to keep up with the demands that they have for us, we're reprimanded and treated and threatened with deportation. And this is exactly what happened to the victims of the Windrush generation. Moving on to my second point. How does the hostile environment affect young people, young migrants? Now, it's important that we don't have selective outrage when campaigning and advocating for the end of the hostile environment. The truth is, the Windrush scandal created a spotlight on the hostile environment policies and how it ripped families apart and forced many into destitution and poverty due to the cost attached to maintaining their status. The Lessons Learned review has created many progressive recommendations for cultural and administrative changes within the Home Office and its practices, but the hostile environment is still alive and well. The GLA published a report back in January 2020 about the fact that there are 133,000 young people who live in London and have grown up here, but don't have any formal immigration status. To say that knowledge is power, many would say that if you know that you're undocumented, then why don't you do something about it? But it's not that simple. The rules are complex, there are cuts to legal aid, and it means that the ordinary member of society will have to educate, re-educate constantly to keep up with the rules and their changes and how these policies impact them. And lastly, even when you do have that knowledge about what your status is and the steps you could potentially take in regularizing your status, there is an insurmountable cost to securing one's status. Let me put this into perspective. For the young people that we work with, they are on the 10-year route to settlement, which means that they're given limited leave to remain as a result of their social integration here and private life in the UK. They must maintain that status for 10 years before they can apply for settlement and then British citizenship. But the cost of this changes every 13 months. The current cost of limited leave to remain is £2,033 in total, taking into consideration the cost for an application as well as the immigration health surcharge, which is compulsory for a complete application. In 2014, the cost of limited leave to remain was £601, and now in 2020, it's £2,033, let alone mentioning the planned increase to the IHS charges in October. Now, the average UK resident does not even have £1,000 of savings, and migrant families are expected to have this and more, despite being in less paid jobs. So this kind of shows the rife inequality that is being, created as a result of the hostile environment, which already exists as a result of inequality in the Black community. So young people are entering adulthood with immense financial hardship, many driven into debt and are under relentless pressure. In 2019, we created this report, which is called Normality is a Luxury. It can be found on our website, webelong.org.uk. And here, there were 14 accounts of young people interviewed, and they spoke about how unforgiving the immigration system is and how it sows division, damages mental health and limits chances. So one of the young people said, "I feel like I'm on probation." The other said, "Having leave to remain does not mean that you are safe. It can be taken away at any time if you can't keep up with the financial demands." Another said, "All our money is tied up into being legal. We count down the days until we are recognized as British. Normality for now is a luxury." So moving on to my final point. We've done a lot of work over the last couple of years to campaign with organizations such as Quorum, JCWI, to highlight the true impacts on the hostile environment on different groups. Our campaign, Chasing Status, calls for an end to the extortionate fees for regularization and citizenship. And it calls for the government to review the long route and review the impacts, the real life impacts, not just statistics, on young people. Because the 10-year route only extends the legal limbo and mental trauma that young people in the migrant community are experiencing. But there is hope. We have a section of the public that are shocked outraged that people who are part of the fabric of this society can be treated in this way. We have a sector who's willing to campaign, funders willing to support financially, and lastly, we have a youth who question the status quo, who are unwilling to settle that because they're migrants, they should be treated this way. We have worked with young people to create an open dialogue between them and policymakers to change the narrative and to ensure that laws are not made without consulting groups that it will impact the most. There is still a long way to go, and we all have a part to play. In going on with our tradition in our organisation, I spoke to the young people about the fact that I was giving this speech today, and they wanted to share these words with you and wanted to say this is what you could do to help raise the profile. So I'll leave you with this. Forget me not when speaking to journalists. Forget me not in select committee meetings and in private meetings with MPs and ministers. Forget me not when the government tap themselves on the back in their handling of the Windrush generation. Let them know that the young people they say are the future need the hostile environment to end in its totality. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chrysanne. It's always a real pleasure to hear about the work that We Belong are doing. As Chrysanne said, if anybody wants to find out more, please visit webelong.org.uk or follow them on Twitter. And that final point there, don't forget us. Forget us not when you're engaging with MPs, with leaders, with decision makers, with people in the media. Our next speaker, who will be giving some closing remarks for the day, her job as Deputy Mayor of London is to improve Londoners' life chances and to ensure that community voice is represented across the Mayor's programme of work. Dr. Debbie Weeks-Bernard is the Deputy Mayor for Social Integration, Social Mobility and Community Engagement. She leads the promotion of equalities and active citizenship across London and makes sure that City Hall actively seeks to tackle poverty and involve community voice across all groups of Londoners. It gives me a lot of pleasure to introduce Debbie Weeks-Bernard. Thanks for joining us today and for giving our closing remarks this morning.
Thanks so much, Satbir. And can I just thank the three amazing speakers that we just heard from. It's always an inspiration to me to see young people who are so active on issues which are important to so many people, speaking so passionately, speaking so knowledgeably. And I'd just like to thank all three of you for your contributions. I'm always inspired by young people. I find that the energy and the vibrancy that they bring to a set of issues always wonderful and always makes me continue to want to strive for justice, which is what I have been doing for all of my working life. And it's great to see the work that the three of you are doing. So thank you so much for that. And I guess I'd just like to start by saying thank you to all of the contributors today. I'd like to thank our three panelists at the start of the session, Arike and Jackie and the Reverend Clive Foster. All of you are working on the front line of these issues. You've been working tirelessly in this space. And were it not for you, there would be so many individuals from the Windrush generation who have been harmed by these policies, who would have been unable to find support, to find guidance, to get access to the information that they need to be able to make those compensation claims. So thank you so much for all that you do and that you continue to do, and for your contributions. Thank you again to Lamisha, Ajioma and Chrysanne, amazing speakers, and thank you for continuing to do that great work that you do. And thank you also to Satbir for chairing so wonderfully throughout the event today. You and JCWI do such great work on these issues, standing up for migrant rights, but also I'd like to thank you for helping us with the Windrush Justice Fund and for helping to seed £40,000 of funding, which we were able to put towards Black-led grassroots organisations who have been working to support those who are seeking advice and guidance to be able to regularise their status, but also to make those important compensation claims that we know that they're entitled to. And of course, I don't know if he's still here, but I'd just like to say a huge thank you, as ever, to Patrick Vernon, who has been a really tireless campaigner throughout his career, who led the charge for the National Windrush Day, who I know was instrumental in the Church of England holding that 1 minute silence today on their online weekly service, but also for the continuous support that he's provided to the Windrush generation throughout this crisis. And I know that he has throughout his whole career stood up for those who have suffered injustice, has always talked about inequality, and will always continue to do so. So thank you, Patrick, for inspiring us at the start, and thank you for all that you do. I'm not going to take up too much time because these are closing statements, and closing statements are supposed to be closing statements, but there are a few things that I think I need to say. I think that at the moment we are clearly celebrating Windrush Day in an unprecedented climate, but I think it's always important to recognise that each time we have celebrated Windrush Day, we've been celebrating it in an unprecedented climate. As Patrick said when he opened up this morning, we know that Windrush Day came out of the Windrush crisis itself, but we also know that all of the policies which drove so many of the Windrush generation and their descendants to experience such harm, to find themselves at risk of destitution and at risk of deportation, and indeed for those who were ultimately deported. We know that all of those policies are still in force. Only 60 people have been able to claim compensation. The hostile immigration environment which led to that crisis still exists. So as much as we are, as I will say, we are celebrating or marking Windrush Day at an unprecedented time, I think every single time we have celebrated Windrush Day, we have celebrated it within a context in which nothing has changed and nothing has moved on. We initially celebrated it or marked it because we needed the world, we needed the nation to recognise what was happening. We celebrated it again last year and nothing yet had really changed. And now this year we're celebrating it at a moment when we are in the midst of a pandemic which we know is disproportionately impacting many people from minority ethnic backgrounds. And we're also celebrating Windrush Day at a moment when there are so many people who are actively and very loudly talking about racial injustices. And so it comes at a time when there is a lot of pain, there is a lot of grief, but it also comes at a time when there is a lot of focus. So the spotlight that our three speakers both talked about is incredibly important. There is a spotlight, not just here in the UK, but there is a spotlight on racial injustice, and we have a moment in which we are able to really talk about those injustices and really amplify what it is that we are all doing to try to rectify those differences. But the point about the 60 is an incredibly important one. I, like many of you on this call, welcomed the announcement today by the government of their cross-governmental working group to put into practice those recommendations from Wendy Williams' Lessons Learned review. As much as it's great to have that announcement, and I have to say, I am incredibly excited that Arike Oke is going to be on that working group from the BCA, because I know that she will be a person who will talk actively, proudly, passionately, but also informatively about all of those individuals who continue to search for justice and who are continuing to seek the compensation that they deserve. Even though all of this is happening, we all know what it is that needs to be done. And I think in the same way that in the government's announcement last week about their BAME commission, and some of the responses that they received as a result of that. And it's similar to this announcement today. I think there are many of us on this call who would be able to say to the government, we know what you need to do. We don't necessarily need to have another opportunity to talk about what it is that you need to do, because we have the Lessons Learned review. And also there are lots and lots of campaigners on this call. And I'm sure that Arike may well say this when she has her first meeting. There are many of us who know exactly what it is that has caused this crisis. And we have said for many, many years what it is that you need to do to address it. You need to rid a society of a hostile immigration environment which creates the problems in the first place. You also need to get rid of those extortionate fees that people seeking to regularize their status have to seek to afford, as our previous speakers mentioned. You need to recognize also that Britishness is not a concept that can be thrown around willy-nilly. It is something which is integral to the lives of individuals who were invited here to work and to contribute, and who have contributed for many, many years. And so there are many things that we know that government needs to do, and what we really need to see, I think, at this moment is action. That's why the Black Lives Matter protests have been so visceral and so important, because they are calling for action. They are not calling for conversation, they are calling for change. And I think that that is what we really need to see. And so I'm very grateful that Arike will be on that working group, because I know that these are things that she cares passionately about. And I know that there are many of us who also are seeking that change and are seeking that action. But I suppose as well as all of that, we've got some things that we can be hopeful for. We can be hopeful that we can have an event like this to get so much expertise in a virtual room on a Monday morning, because that just shows how much expertise and knowledge there is in our communities. So there is a lot to be hopeful for, and all of you are testament, I think, to the knowledge that we will not give up, that there will always be somebody there who will be shouting about this issue. There are so many of us that it's very unlikely that this is an issue that will fall off a political agenda. So that's something that we need to be really hopeful about. But also I'm really hopeful about the work that we're all doing to make sure that we can improve the advice and guidance that people have access to. So the Mayor mentioned that we have this Justice Together Fund. It's a fund that we've contributed to. It's a fund that has been contributed to by many funders, not just here in London, but across the country, which is about trying to address the fact that there is a real decimation in the legal advice sector across the country and also here in London. And it's the legal advice and the immigration advice sector that those from the Windrush generation and those with insecure status need to be able to rely on, so that they are able to make those claims for compensation, so that they are able to make those applications to regularise their status. And we know that there are legal advice and immigration advice deserts in this city and across the UK. And so that Justice Together Fund will help us to work towards trying to boost that sector, which we know is what we need to be able to provide that advice and that guidance for people who sorely need it. We also do need to recognise that all this spotlight sharing that has happened is incredibly important. We know that, I mentioned before, that the fact that we are in a pandemic, but we also do need to recognise that there are individuals who, for a range of different reasons, have very little faith and very little trust in a lot of the institutions which exist to support us. So as much as we have clapped every Thursday, and I know that's stopped now, for our frontline workers, I don't think there was as much of a recognition of the fact that those frontline workers who are putting themselves at risk have a disproportionately high number of people who come from minority, ethnic and migrant backgrounds, and those are the individuals who are often putting themselves at risk. But also at the same time, that there are some communities, many of the communities that we are from, who do not have enough trust in that NHS which welcomed them all those years ago to treat them, who feared going in to get advice, to get treatment, to access what they have the right to access. And we need to do better. We have institutions which exist to serve our communities, but our communities do not trust those institutions. They do not trust the NHS as much as they should be able to. They do not trust the police as much as they should do. They do not trust the education system as much as they should be able to. And they certainly do not trust the Home Office, which is the reason that we're all here. So we need to do better. We need to have institutions that people have faith in, and that people fully believe will act on their behalf. So I said I wasn't going to say too much, and I've probably rambled on for quite some time, but I really just want to say again to all of you, thank you so much for all that you continue to do. It helps us at the GLA to continue to make those asks of government that we make all the time, but we're also here to support and amplify all of the work that you are doing. And I hope that this has been an event that has given everybody the opportunity to hear about the great work that you're doing, but also to keep this issue on the political agenda. It's important that it needs to stay there, because if those hostile environment policies still exist, then we will never get justice for those individuals who have suffered as a result of them. Thank you so much for your time today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Thank you so much.